Thank you, Marta. Hello, everyone. So, as Marta mentioned, my name is Iakovina Kindylidi. I was not supposed to be alone today, at least from the VDA side. So, first of all, thank you to Marta and everyone from Deep Learning Sessions for extending the invite to my boss, for my boss extending the invite to me, and also for André to join us today, and Unbabel for hosting us. So, the name is weird. It's Iakovina Kindylidi because it's a Greek name, but I live here for the past 5 years almost. I'm a lawyer, both in Greece and in Portugal, and I work in the ICT area of VDA. So I specialize on technologies, and I'm also a guest lecturer in Nova School of Law, where I'm also doing my PhD on AI, law, and behavioral ethics. So with that capacity, I'm more or less here. I will start a bit the presentation, then Andre will pick up. I know that Marta said to keep your questions at the end, but I think it's a very cozy environment here in Unbabel, so we can be a bit more dynamic and try to share some thoughts while we move onward. So I will ask questions. I'm expecting you to reply, even if just to nod and raise hands, but let's try to have some fun with the topic that it is particularly hot and it's not very easy to unbundle for sure. But hopefully we can reach some conclusions today and share some ideas. So in the next few minutes, I will talk a bit about the rise of AI regulation, but regulation does not come a bit on its own. So it looks at what the industry is doing, and it's taking advantage of hopefully opportunities that is trying to boost, or at least this is what we say that it's trying to do. And first of all, oh, okay. Yes, it's working, everything's fine. I would like to talk also a bit about Portugal, because Portugal has been very active when it comes to AI. Unbabel and VDA are involved in the Responsible AI Consortium. It is the biggest right now, aiming to develop responsible AI solutions. So I would like, first of all, to ask you, what do you think are the most common applications of AI in Portugal? And guess. Hmm? ChatGPT, probably right now it is, yes. I know I have a tab open there on my computer every day, and I do use it every day. So before ChatGPT, however, Portugal already from 2021 was scoring second in Europe in the use of AI. Of course, the levels of AI adoption in Europe are still quite low, but Portugal was coming second, third was Norway, Finland, and the first was Denmark with 24 and then 17 and 16. Okay, so it's very low, but it was still pretty up there, and it was because of the AI industry and companies like Unbabel actually trying to create AI solutions. But starting from there, and also with AI solutions that they are not really Portuguese, from my experience, the majority of our clients that they are from medium to very large clients, both based in Portugal or fully Portuguese or having presence here, the main uses of AI fall in these categories. So HR management, starting from selection of employees to managing HR to helping them categorize the progression of the employees. Digital marketing, biometrics, mostly for accessing buildings. We tried outside, the camera was not working, so an example as well could be this. Virtual assistants, from very not that complicated systems to, for example, booking health appointments, making bank transfers to ChatGPT, and of course, translation tools, and in general, large language models like the ones of Unbabel. And of course, these categories are interesting because they are reflected, some of them at least, also in the AI regulation. Some of them as high risk level systems, as we will see later on. But this was supposed to be with animation. Okay, so you're seeing the PDF version and it looks very baffled, but it was supposed to change, and it was saying what are the main business, legal, and ethical challenges of AI. Okay, and this also is a question to you. So, of course, there are opportunities in developing, using, adopting AI solutions, integrating into your products and services in your everyday life, like ChatGPT and me correcting my emails. But there are a lot of business challenges associated. And these challenges are also reflected in the legal challenges and in the ethical ones. So first of all, with the business, what do you think are the main business challenges for a company, let's say, that wants to develop AI or wants to acquire an AI solution? Yes. So the business challenge is a legal challenge. Correct. More also. So costs, we can say very close related to this. What about talent? Like, I don't know your backgrounds. I believe many of you here know much more about the technology itself than me. But it's not easy, and it's not easy to acquire talent, and it's not easily to attract talent, especially in places like Portugal, although this is changing, and like my country, Greece, for instance. But so the commission tried a bit to quantify this. They did it in 2020. Probably the numbers have changed, but more or less the difficulties are the same. And if we were to look at it, we could sort of divide it between internal and external challenges. So first of all is talent, then is cost of adoption, licenses, uncertainty as well, because it includes the risk, I will say, and the operational processes, either to develop them from scratch or to acquire them and make sure that they can seamlessly be part of your business process. And then on the external, again, uncertainty on the external part regarding liabilities. And this is an interesting thing because it came up again as one of the main risks and the main drawbacks for adoption on AI in Europe: data standardization, because of course, and accessibility, I will add, not only standardization, and there is some effort in the EU to sort of tackle that, and regulatory obstacles. So all the external problems are more or less legal, and the biggest one of them and that is why it's with a different color there, is lack of trust to the digital environment and lack of trust to the technology itself due to those challenges. And the main reason for all this, yes? Oh, I'm sorry? Yes, but from a business perspective, because that was made from a business perspective, not from the individual user perspective. When you are facing possible fines, you know, it was a bit, and also an important thing, this study was from 2 years before ChatGPT was launched to the world fully. So it took place way before we saw how this would work, how would people use it on a day-to-day basis. But we are talking about much more complex also solutions of AI than ChatGPT. And again, I will mention that when the Eurostat made this. So this is now it's 2 years and a half ago, meaning 2 years and a half ago from when it was published. It is impressive to see the development of the society and the change in the culture, but I think your average company, when it wants to adopt an AI solution, it's still quite conservative. And from a practical standpoint, I'll tell you how you see the fear that is associated with the possibility of risk that comes from the lack of trust. Many companies are using AI and they are not mentioning it. They are doing it in a small level at a pilot phases to avoid publicizing it fully. The companies that you mentioned are known for their innovation and already they are technology driven. So it's also part of the hype to mention that you are supporting this. So it really depends, and I don't think it's a blank statement. However, it's very important, and you're absolutely right, that the perception has changed over the years. And the reason why it pushed forward the change was because of ChatGPT. We saw a fast forward in adoption, but also in regulation. And we will talk about this immediately afterwards with André. Well, for sure. But there are a list of problems here, and that is another thing that still remain. And this is what the regulation needs to tackle. And those challenges will keep on being because they are inherent to the technology. So biases will still be a problem in 2024, even if the world changes. The functionalities of the technology as such that is based on these very deep neural networks and the statistical based truths, together with the difficulty to identify the errors and therefore correct them, and what we call these two final parts as the black box problem, opacity problem, if you want to say it from the legal standpoint, they generate three main legal and ethical challenges that they are the source of all the discussion, both technically, ethically, legally. And from a legal standpoint, they are intertwined. So one cannot be seen without the other. So first of all, the lack of transparency that comes from this inability to see the process that it takes from the input to the output, explainability, and accountability. And all the regulatory initiatives that have happened so far, they are exactly aiming to tackle these three, let's say, main challenges and variations of those challenges. So what will the AI regulation look like maybe in 2024 and even further than this? First of all, it is very important to sort of clarify that the fact that we don't have a regulation that says this applies to all AI, this does not mean that we don't have laws that apply to AI. All the laws in Europe and the majority of the world, because this is a stance that is started already from the UN, they are technology neutral. And this means what? This means that they do not blankly prohibit or cover one specific technology. Even the AI Act that specifically refers to AI, we will see later on that in reality does not cover all the AI cases. It covers some of them. And practically, you have a very robust framework, let's say, at least in terms of laws, whether they work or not, it's another topic, that apply also to AI. I use this example because it's the simplest one to understand. That is the GDPR, for example. So GDPR does apply to AI and does apply to data as it applies to other technologies. Whether it's fully suitable for it and whether it requires some adaptations, yes, it does. But also it's another topic. And it's also important to consider that at the same time, we had two competing powers in the EU. So we had the need to protect data and to make sure that we comply with the fundamental rights that we consider that in the European society are necessary. But at the same time, the EU realized that the GDPR was very protective of data, that it was limiting access to data. And that's why the AI market, the EU AI market was not competitive. So the last 2 years almost is trying sort of to amend this. And we already have the Data Governance Act that is already into force and it will apply fully in September onwards. We have the Data Act in a proposal phase, and we have what they call various EU common data spaces. So in key sectors for the European market, you will have these pools of data where companies will need to contribute, but also they will be able to reach out and have access to data. And the main reason for this is exactly to boost AI training and its life cycle as well. So also the use, not only training validation processes. But focusing a bit on the AI Act. So I mentioned that it does not apply to everyone, okay? So it does not apply to every AI solution, and it's because it follows a risk-based approach, meaning it has certain AI use cases that apply, that do not apply that the regulation does not apply to them. So they are the low and minimal risk ones. But for those, everything else that already existed in the EU still applies. So they will still need to comply with the general regulatory framework, even like sector-specific applications. Then we have those that are considered limited risk AI, that imposes some additional transparency obligations. So deep fakes, emotional recognition technology, with some exceptions that they're considered prohibited or high risk, especially with the new text of the regulation. And then we have some that they are considered high risk that you can introduce in the market, provided that you comply with all the obligations of the system. Added to that, foundation models that André will mention later on, and some that are considered completely unacceptable for the use, so they cannot be applied. For instance, social scoring, mass surveillance, minority report scenarios with preventive policing, and so on. And this list got expanded because we had a text that came out in 2021. This is the official one that we have to this day. But 2 weeks ago, it changed, it expanded. They reached in a compromise text in the European Parliament. It will be voted, the final text, mid-June. We'll see how this will go. But let's say if it passes as it is, using this text, we will enter what is called the trialogue discussions. So you will have the European Commission, the Parliament, and the EU Council all discussing together for the laws. Then it will be a matter of how fast they are, how efficient they will want to be to also get on to the momentum of AI regulation. No matter what, this solution, because it's already underway for quite some time, it will be the first comprehensive AI regulation in the world. And it is important. Why? Because we're facing again here a bit the Brussels effect, meaning EU exporting regulation outside of Europe. It happened with the GDPR. It happens again here if the wording remains the same. This means what? If this comes into play exactly as it is, it will apply also to AI systems that, although the provider is not based in the EU, if it brings its system into the EU market, or the effects of the AI, whatever that is, a decision-making process, has an impact in the EU, it will apply, they will need to comply with the AI regulation. The obligations look a bit like GDPR. So there is a lot of reporting, there is a lot of risk assessment, there is a data governance that is quite strict for the foundation models that André will mention later on, a lot of documentation. And I would like to mention only one thing that was added only now in that last version of the text, the obligation to carry fundamental rights impact assessment. So this is something that we have been working on in practice for a while, especially for companies that they wanted to reduce the risk or identify the risks. But now it became an obligation. It was something that was not on the original text. And what is interesting is that it applies both to the provider of the AI, but also to the user, the professional users of AI. Now they're calling them deployers. Now they also need to carry this, provided that the solution will be a high risk one, but also as a best practice for all AI cases. And what I mentioned before, yes.
It is a great effort to cover all possible AI cases. Yet there is a gray zone. Today, we have huge open source community effort to make foundation models available to everyone. And we already know that it is possible to train and fine tune up to 65 billion parameters on a single GPU. So how is Commission going to fight the gray zone development of technology?
You will cover that afterwards. So we'll keep the reply for 2 minutes from now. So just I put the quote here because it was from the study that I was mentioning, but to mention also 2 more initiatives, although I'm not going to cover the context. So the AI Act does not include civil liability rules. So practically, if an AI harms you, that is a high risk based on the how it's identified in the regulation, you cannot go to court, let's say, and ask for damages. And to cover that, in September of last year, 2 proposals came out. One is the Product Liability Directive, number 2. So the Product Liability Directive is 38 years old, and it does not cover AI. It does not even cover services, except if it was transposed like that into national law, which did not happen in Portugal, for example. And now they're trying to adapt it and update it and make it apply also to AI and to also update it to the digital age in general. So one is this, and then the other one is the civil liability for AI that applies to everyone. So it will also apply to private uses of AI. If I harm with my AI robot that for some reason I have at home, let's say someone, it will not apply to cars. However, that is staying outside of the scope. And so what do we do to tackle the legal challenges before the AI Act comes into play and until then? Three main blocks, let's say. First of all, we need to look at the AI life cycle as a whole, because there are different challenges throughout. Some are the same, but some of them might be more prominent at the beginning. So the data governance part, for example, that is the second pillar that we need to look at, might be more evident when we are training the model, when we're using validation data, and not that much, for example, when you're just testing. And then it comes again into play in the use, depending on the use of AI. So that is the second thing, data governance, but not only for personal data, also the non-personal part of the data, and knowing your pools, knowing your sources, making sure that you have clarified the provision of information, the responsibilities. So also those check boxes for the open source data sets as well. And then the last bit is the AI impact assessment. So it can be legal, it can be ethical, it can be much broader than this, and that's why I don't even call it legal. That what you need to do in reality, you need to understand the technology that you have at play in the particular use of the technology. So not in any case the AI in abstract, but the sector, who will be the user, who is the one that trains it, what is the relationship with the different AI providers or data providers. And until we have a liability regime, and this was something that one commissioner mentioned in a seminar, and I think it's quite interesting to have the regulator saying, put it in your contract. So already the obligations to provide information and make it clear and transparent of who is liable, to make sure that at the end of the day, you are going to mitigate the risks, that people will not be afraid of the fines that are quite high in the AI Act at the end of the day. Yes.
Speaking of AI impact assessment, today we don't know what foundational models are capable for. We have some hinges, like it learned arithmetics from text. God knows what they're capable for. So how are we going to establish a ubiquitous framework for assessment of this impact if we don't know what it is?
You will not carry an impact assessment on a foundation model as a whole. It will be on a specific use case in practice. Okay, not it is impossible to do it in general, and it won't have an application as well. It's the risk of being too broad for the impact assessment. It needs to be specific, otherwise you won't be able to identify the risks and you won't be able to mitigate them. So that will not be the case at the end. And that's an issue of the regulation of the foundational models that André will mention.
Okay. Okay, so give me a second to transition. All right. Okay. So, well, thanks, Iakovina, for the first parts. I will follow up now. So, I'm André Martins. I work at Unbabel, actually. I'm the VP of IR research here. I'm also a professor at the Instituto Superior Técnico in the University of Lisbon. Yeah, so the opinions that I'm going to say now are my own opinions, not Unbabel's or Technic's opinions. And I must say that I don't know much about legal or regulation. Okay, so you know, Iakovina is the expert on those topics. So what I'm going to do is to wear my AI researcher hats and try to express some of the concerns or risks that I see with this regulation, and open the floor for discussing this with you. All right, so this pyramid has already been introduced by Iakovina. Now we have these different layers. It's a risk-based approach where the top of the pyramid are technology, is technology that is essentially forbidden. Then we have high risk, limited risk, and minimal risk. Okay, so and I think this started to be prepared in 2021 roughly. And technology moves very quickly. And so today we are talking about the big elephant in the room, which was asked in one of the questions. So there's many models like ChatGPT and others that really don't fit anywhere in that pyramid, or at least not in the way things were stated in the beginning. So the big question is, where should we put these elephants? And I think the decision was mostly to consider foundation models, this kind of models, as an example of high risk applications. But there is a lot in the new version. So the new draft, I think it was finished around 2 weeks ago, something like that. And there's lots of text that is specific to foundation models. So I'm going to focus on those parts, okay? I don't know if this part is actually updated. I think this is the general procedure that is required for our risk AI systems. So the system is developed, and then there is like a loop where in step 2, it needs to undergo a conformity assessment in which he has to comply with several AI requirements. So then in step 3, there is the requirement of registering this system in a EU database. And then at step 4, there is a declaration of conformity needs that needs to be signed and so on. And only after that, the system can be put in the market. And then because these systems, are continuously retrained, we might have substantial changes. Maybe the system got some new capabilities that it didn't have before. And we might need to go back to step 2 and repeat everything again. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about foundation models. I don't like the name foundation very much, but so this is basically Stanford University's brands. The community, used the name large language models and other things, but they realized that you can build models not just for text, but also for images, models that are multimodal, that support multiple modalities. And in Stanford, they came up with this foundation models name. Sometimes people misuse the name and call them foundational models, but avoid calling them foundational. Actually, I think the text is a bit inconsistent. Some parts say foundation, others say foundational. But so this is kind of a plot that expresses the number of parameters of these models evolving over time. So this is in the last 5 years. It's not up to date. There are way more models here. And notice that this y-axis is in log scale. Okay, so the thing that you see here is an exponential growth, at least until 2023. Things might be changing now. And what we see is that these days, models like Palm have 500 billion parameters, which is huge. Again, I think this tendency appears to be slowing down, but no one really knows because big corporations are not transparent about the number of parameters of their models. There's information that is leaked sometimes, but that's about it. And if you look at the web about how many parameters GPT-4 has, you see all sorts of speculations. Most of them are completely wrong, but I will probably bet on something around hundreds of billions again. Anyway, so also these models are trained on a lot of data, okay? So much more data that any human being or much more text that a human being sees in a lifetime. So, things that are web scale, and it's likely that we are kind of reaching the limit of textual data that is available. So I don't know if you can keep growing the amount of data in which these models are trained on. So this poses a lot of scalability problems, as you can imagine. There was a question about open source large language models. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Things are moving very fast, and I think this is actually the biggest challenge of coming up with regulation is that, from 2021, which is when this text started, until now, the technology evolved very, very quickly. We didn't have the same kind of foundation models that we have today. And even in the open source community, things were very different. Of course, there was lots of models that were released openly by the research community, not with the same size. And now, this year there's been a lot of effort from the open source community releasing new models, and I think this is very, very interesting. So people are writing a lot about that. Of course, this is a challenge to some of the corporations like OpenAI, Google, and Microsoft. And there is a big distinction between what these open source communities are doing and what, for example, OpenAI is doing. OpenAI is very closed. We don't know how many parameters their models have. We don't know which data they used. I mean, their product is amazing, but they're not very transparent, okay? And this contrasts with some of the efforts that I see is happening now in open source communities, where things are much more visible, okay? And also available for scrutiny and for study by other researchers. Okay, so this is just like a small picture that illustrates, and this is not up to date, so the things that are, I don't know if you can see the highlights here, but the models that are shaded are the ones that are open source. The ones that are not shaded are not open source. So you see lots of OpenAI models here that are not open source, but there's also a lot, some of them also released by companies like Google and Meta that are open. And then there are, of course, several degrees of open that I'm not going to discuss here, different licenses, but this is the current paradigm, okay? Any questions? So feel free to interrupt with questions anytime. No, so far so good. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the wonderful 144 pages. Well, I didn't read the entire, yeah.
This distinction about scary foundational models, does it apply to different domains? Like we have models for chemistry that definitely help design better drugs. They are identical by design, but they are not trained on texts. Sometimes they can produce toxic or even lethal output. What's going to happen for those models that are not made from text, but from physical or chemical data? Where would they fall in regulation field?
I don't know if the AI Act is explicit about that. Probably not. Yeah. So what I've seen is that the foundation models that are trained on trillions of data, they use wherever data is available. They use a mixture of text, codes, other things, and the amount of data that you have for specialized domains is usually much smaller. Both for chemistry, there's also efforts in building a scientific foundation model. So I think this might change in the future as more data comes in, but it's probably not a big issue right now. That is my guess. And apparently the text doesn't say anything specific about that. Okay, so being considered a high-risk AI system, it needs to comply with these steps. Foundation models need to go through these steps. And there is a set of obligations that I'm trying to summarize here, and please correct me if I'm missing something important. So I think that, so first there is a distinction between LLM providers and LLM deployers, where providers are basically the ones that, make foundation models available, and the deployers are the ones that integrate that in their system. I think that's roughly something like this. So the providers have to register their high-risk foundation model with the government. I think there is a huge database that is going to be built for that purpose. They also need to register the anticipated functionality of their system. And I think this part is a little bit problematic because it's very hard to anticipate, what's going to happen in the future, given the rates that things are evolving. And systems that exceed this functionality, they have to go back to step 2 and being reassessed. So I can see a problem here with many of the open source projects in particular, where we cannot anticipate fully what are going to be the functionalities in which this model is going to be used. Then there is a third point, which is the systems need to, or the providers need to disclose the data sources that are used with some detail. From what I read, I found that a little bit vague. I don't know exactly in which detail. I think there is a distinction between copyrighted data that is not copyrighted. I think it's a good thing that you have something that encourages or requires providers to be open about the data that is used. Oh, no? Can you hear better now? Okay, I was just with the microphone very far. Okay, so disclosing the data sources, I think it's a good thing. Notice that OpenAI doesn't do that currently. Okay, computing resources, this includes the time spent training. This might be a little bit tricky to report in an objective way. The performance benchmarks and red teaming, which is basically what you do to make your systems robust against attacks that try to extract some toxic information from your models. So there is some requirements of disclosing this information. Then we have another thing, which is the providers need to pass extensive and expensive licensing, risk testing, and the conformity assessment that I was talking about. I think this is probably the thing that is going to be the most problematic for startups, SMEs, and so on. I mean, for big companies, I think they're probably fine with this. They have the means and the resources to pass these conformity assessments. But if you are a smaller company that wants to compete with OpenAI, it's probably not going to be that easy. I'm going to come back to this in a bit. So I don't know much about, I think there's not much information about how these tests and benchmarks are going to be developed. I think the goal is to have third-party companies in member states that are going to charge fees for doing this. Then there is also an obligation of having the systems monitored post-release. So it's just, things don't finish when you just release your model and you pass the tests. There is some effort. I don't know how it's going to be monitored, but it's written there. And there is a recertification that is required if models show some unexpected ability that they didn't have before, or if they were trained with more data. And then there is a huge fine, I think 20 million euros, or even worse, if you fail to comply with massive fines, right? I think it's something like 4% of okay. So the minimum is 20 million euros. Okay, so one thing that I find very, very concerning is that there is no exemptions for open source large language models. And in my opinion, the current AI Act drafts makes life very difficult for open source initiatives. So this is something that I hope that the community reacts and can change things. Because as far as I know, the AI Act is not finished, right? There is still time for incorporating feedback. So I think there are some open source exceptions for traditional machine learning models, maybe before they edited the text to incorporate foundation models, but not for open source generative systems. Okay, they explicitly say that they are also required to do the same things as everybody else. Another thing is open source developers and hosting services like GitHub apparently are going to be liable for making licensed models available, which again is very concerning, right? I don't know if this is very accurate or not, but I saw this being discussed. So this is going to put a big burden on testing and certification, even for models that are not part of a product. So these requirements are not just if you want to build a product and sell something. They apply for everybody that develops a foundation model, every provider. And I think this is very bad for research and for open science. And it might create obstacles for innovation that are going to affect mostly EU startups and SMEs. So at the same time, I think that big tech companies, they might have some trouble doing some of these things, but it's probably going to be easier for them to pass these certifications because they have resources that they can use to do that. At the same time, they can also use these regulations for gatekeeping, meaning that they're going to make things harder for smaller companies to grow and to compete with them. So this is something that I'm particularly concerned about. I'm not going to bother you with these details. This is one of the articles that says that this is the provider needs to be compliant with the requirements, regardless of whether it is provided as a standalone model or embedded in an AI system or a product, or provided under free and open source licenses as a service, as well as other distribution channels. So it's very, very general. So to conclude, before opening the floor for discussion, so there is something that I'm very puzzled about. So I think this happened last week, or it keeps on going. So this discussion is happening everywhere in the world, of course, not just in Europe. In the US Congress, they invited some people to discuss AI regulation. And something that I'm very puzzled about, because we are used, to the situation where big corporations don't want regulation. They are usually against regulation, right? Regulation is something that protects citizens from the hands of big corporations in the ideal world. But something that I think is really unprecedented is happening. You see big tech companies that are advocating for more regulation in the US Congress. This is basically the speech of Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, which for those who are not aware are behind ChatGPT and a lot of these foundation models. And I think this deserves some reflection. Why would OpenAI want more regulation? I mean, if one possibility is that maybe, Sam Altman is really concerned about the well-being of citizens and, having safe AI. That might be a genuine concern. But another less naive reading is that is protecting OpenAI interests by making it harder for others to grow and catch up with OpenAI. So food for thought. I'm not going to give you the answers. So some final thoughts. I think even though it might have give the impression that I was speaking against regulation, I think regulating AI is very important. I'm a strong believer in responsible AI, and much of my work is related to responsible AI. But I have some concerns about some of the added requirements on the AI Act, in particular the new part about foundation models, which seem to be ill-defined, hard to implement, and I think they might be counterproductive. They seem to discourage AI startups and SMEs to compete in the real game. And note that you don't have big tech in Europe in this space, so we are not even protecting big European companies. They also seem to compromise open source initiatives and open research. They seem to protect the monopoly of large tech companies who already created and deployed their models without regulation. Again, this is my opinion; it's not a fact. They also, I think they might contribute to create an ecosystem that is too dependent on these large companies, as opposed to making room for the open source community or smaller companies to innovate and compete with the big tech. So I think that if we are concerned about safety and transparency, the way to do that is openness, and we need to have regulations that encourage more openness in developing these systems. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Boa tarde. Good afternoon. So I'm asking if systems can copy your voice, how humans can protect themselves. Should we make a patent with our voice? That's my question related to voice and also sentiment analysis, because I don't see many people talking about sentiment analysis, and TikTok is already using sentiment analysis. Thank you.
Yeah, it's true that usually the majority of the provisions of the first text and this one, they focus on the face. In theory, when you're talking about emotion recognition, however, it needs to extend also to voice. So from an interpretation standpoint, let's say that the law passes and it's like that, it will apply. So it will be considered prohibited if it happens under certain circumstances. So if it happens in the public, let's say, or for work purposes or educational purposes, to test your voice, or for law enforcement, this is already included in. And then for any other case like TikTok, for example, they will need to tell you that they're doing it, and they need to disclose it while they're doing it. And you will practically need to consent to it. So the issue, of course, will be whether this will be happening also in that function of TikTok that is it refers to children. And then it will be interesting to see how will be the interplay with GDPR, because you have the threshold for the 13 years, for instance, but I think we can agree that it's very invasive to identify the emotion of a minor, even if it's 13 years old, and for the GDPR purposes could have a profile, let's say, on TikTok, which of course it's questionable still, but okay. And much more invasive when we're talking about its emotional status, recognition of its voice. that can also identify, because voice is considered to be a sensitive piece of data. It can disclose information probably about your age, your sex, and even your mood. Very related to the emotions as well. So in principle, it will apply and it will be considered either as a subject to restrictions under certain circumstances, to prohibition, not restrictions, or to requirements for transparency from the Act.
So, thank you for the talk. I think it was very interesting, and I had two questions. The first is quite general, is about how would you characterize the European approach to AI regulation as compared, or the discussions that are happening now, as compared to the US discussions or the UK or China's, what's happening comparatively across the world. And the second is a more practical questions, which I didn't understand quite well. So in that risk pyramid that you showed there, for instance, the tip of the pyramid is the unacceptable risk. So if I have a company and I'm developing a product with unacceptable risk, but in the European Union, I'm only training my systems using data, using GDPR compliant, everything GDPR, but I'm only training it and I'll use it elsewhere. Is that also forbidden or not? Two questions.
So for the first one, so that right now, let's say we can divide it into approaches. So it's the European approach, we're trying to regulate, and then it's the US approach that practically they are trying to do now something with those hearings that also André showed. But the problem with the US is the same with the GDPR. It happened exactly the same thing. So they realized that they were too late, but the reason why they were too late to react and they will have to accept it, it's because of their own system. So there are not federal provisions that can help them. They are state-based. So for example, with GDPR, it happened the same thing. They saw what happened. They did some hearings with Meta, okay? And then what happened was California passed the law that resembles to a large extent GDPR, plus with some consumer protection perspective, because they don't have a framework consumer protection laws. So I think US is not really an approach right now. There are some state initiatives like New York try to do something. They are promoting some standards in relation to NIST that mirror immensely Europe, and especially the AI high level group work that I had done, this self-regulatory checklist that came out in 2020 was before the regulation passed, was the first action of the EU. And if you see now, those provisions passed in the new version of the text of the regulation. So suddenly they remembered again sustainability and the environmental part of AI as well. So there is a mirroring in the US. The UK is following a more wait and see approach. And is that part that, okay, let's see what Europe will do. At the same time, we are issuing guidelines and they are the most active in guidelines. And in practice right now, these are the ones that we are sort of keeping an eye on, because until we have a regulation, when we have clients, but also on a research basis, and we're trying to develop models to help identify the legal challenges and mitigate them, the model of UK, especially with the work of ICO, so the Information Commissioner Officer, it's more or less like CNPD in Portugal, so the privacy authority, are the ones that we follow the most. But they are not global. They focus more on the privacy matter, although they are trying now to be more active with ChatGPT, with all the buzz, also with Italy banning it in very big quotes. For the first part of your question is more complicated. In principle, it will still apply because it will be considered that is in the market. So the regulation, because it has that tendency to attract and grasp as many entities as it can, it will apply, but it's not clear. So it's very broadly put, and we will have to see how it will be in practice. So now what they put in this new version, they left the geographical scope very broad as it is. So also to apply in those cases, probably. But they introduced the idea of an AI office. So that AI office will look probably very much like a European authority almost, and will issue guidelines or help the Commission issue guidelines to help identify how we will apply this. So probably it will be like European Data Protection Board for GDPR that came and said, okay, if a processing activity is happening here, even if we are not, even if it accidentally happens in Europe, let's say like the training, we catch this processing activity and GDPR will apply. So probably the AI Act will apply as well. But we'll see.
Can we get back to emotion recognition question? There is great work done, especially in Technico, sponsored by European Commission, towards adaptation of autistic kids. They are physically incapable of recognizing human emotions. How is it possible that European Commission at the same time supports efforts that help them adapt to the world and effectively is going to ban
It's exempted.
technology?
It's exempted. There is an exception on these that specifically refers to the use of neurosciences for identification of emotion for health-related purposes. There is an exception specifically for that. It's in the recitals, it's in the law. It's the only exception that they have introduced.
So kids are going to have right to have emotional copilots.
Yes.
Very good.
If you see the recitals, they refer specifically to this.
Good. So I just have 3 questions very specifically. One of them is like just general comments. It's gonna be a little bit research focused. So André, if you feel like thinking about it, is what's your take on the general definitions of AI? Because the assumption is we all agree on what AI is, just from the regulatory perspective and also from the general perspective. Like what's your take on that? And then the second one is probably gonna be back to you about exemption on car, on the application of some of these regulations, particularly for cars. I think I would be interested to know the why and the logic behind that. And then the third thing is just kind of like an opinion, which is on top of being an opinion is kind of like also a general observation. There is a general assumption that the world is making that all innovation has to happen between either US or EU, and the kind of regulation that is happening is, or that is going to happen, is probably just going to have an impact on EU. Like you say, it's some technologies that we have to import at the EU is probably going to have to be this. But then there are other measures that this kind of regulation will never really be able to cover, because something can easily move from a minimum risk to a high risk. And the kind of technologies that we are really trying to regulate will never really ever be covered by this kind of thing, because ChatGPT, for instance, we never even thought that it could come up. And a concept of artificial general intelligence will never ever be covered by this kind of regulation, because the idea is that you don't know what the output would ever become, and you're not even sure on what it is that you will find out from this. So in a way, this is kind of like your opinion. Do you really think that this kind of regulation would have an impact to the world in what it is that we are trying to shape it to become?
Yeah, so these are very good questions. I don't have good answers to those questions. Can you hear me? Yeah. So first, the definition of artificial intelligence. I think there was a lot of discussion in the EU AI Act because people could not agree on the definition, which I'm not surprised about. No one has a good definition. I think they ended up adopting the one from OCDE, which is, very broad. I personally, I don't have like a good definition myself, but I'm not a big fan of AGI, the expression AGI, or even sometimes when you talk about AI approaching human intelligence. I think what we are observing is a different kind of intelligence that is not a subset of human intelligence. So, some features might approach things that humans are able to do, which is due to the fact that these things are trained on data that is generated by humans, so they are kind of reproducing what humans express as text or whatever kind of content. But there is a big difference, which is these machines have much more communication power than humans have. So there is a nice Neil Lawrence has a nice concept called embodiment factor, which is the ratio between what is your computation power divided by what is your communication bandwidth. So humans have much more communication power. Our brains can perform a lot more compute than the most powerful GPU or TPU that is available by orders of magnitude. But we have much worse communication bandwidth. I cannot, clone my brain in another person, or I cannot quickly transfer my information to people in the audience. I need to build an internal model of everybody, right? In order to act, I need to have a theory of mind in order to act in the real world. And this is something that is very different in AI. You can easily copy a model, clone a model, start from a particular checkpoint, keep training. And the amount of data that these models process, it's much superior than the amount of data that humans normally process. So I don't know if that kind of answers your question. I think there was something else that I didn't answer, right? But maybe you can repeat. Oh, yes. Yeah, so this is also a very good point. I think you are totally right that I think there is an idea that all the innovation has to be born in the US or European Union. Of course, that's not the case. And it's not, I think the world is changing in that sense. And I don't know, maybe Iakovina has a better answer to that question. I think that it's always very hard to come up with regulation that tries to anticipate what's going to happen. It's just hard, right? As you were saying, ChatGPT is an instance of a system that maybe when it appeared, people thought they should be classified it as low risk, but the kind of things that you can build with it quickly bumped it up in the pyramid. So the same thing can happen in the future with other kinds of technology. So this is why I think, I don't think that regulations should be too strict or to try to put things in boxes, because we are very bad at classifying things.
I'll pick up from that because I was thinking about the definition, and I think your last question ties up a bit with your first. So the first draft, the official draft that we have, was horrible. I don't know, like, of course we reacted from the legal standpoint and a research standpoint, but also I think the industry itself did not react as much as it should, because what they have done was they had introduced a very descriptive definition, and then they had introduced an annex, and that annex had a list, and that list was fixed, so was not changing, and they were numbering techniques to achieve AI. Amongst the techniques that they had put in there were also statistical based truths as a fact, so an Excel sheet. Okay, of course, I'm pushing it, but it was very narrowed down. So we are gradually moving in order to understand that we need to develop a more dynamic regulation, but it was certain from the get-go that the definition would change. It would not pass. From a research standpoint, legal research standpoint, there have been efforts to find a better definition. Honestly, I'm more in favor of a big one, descriptive one that can adapt to the different types of models. More or less, we can all agree that, let's say, a basic bot is not AI. So, for example, by giving, let's say, an artificial agent reference that achieves predefined goals, let's say, that the human is involved, that it has data as well in the definition. So a more descriptive model can accommodate a more future-proof quality on the regulation. And that is also related with the high-risk list. So the first high-risk list was made there ideally to promote clarity. This is what they wanted to do. So instead of you trying to figure out whether your system is high risk or not, they gave you a list, and the European Commission every year would go and update it. Like, bureaucratically speaking, this is crazy. Let's say that this could work. Still, it could create a very possible scenario where technology is high risk today and is not tomorrow, and vice versa. The model remains the same, but they did two new things in this model and in this new draft, and we'll see how this will go. But I think it's positive at least to start discussing on how to tackle this. One provision is, even if the model that you're operating is not falling in the list of high-risk systems, if it is possible that it will generate risks for the health, safety, and fundamental rights of users, it will be considered high risk and you will need to comply in any case. So a more dynamic, let's say, self-assessment tool without saying how you will do the self-assessment, another thing. And then even if you are on the list, exactly the reverse, so you are considered to be a high risk system, if you believe that in reality you are not posing risks to fundamental rights, health, safety, even environment in certain circumstances, you go to the authority and you say, I'm not high risk because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then they will exclude you. This is also a way to make it more dynamic and avoid the Commission having to know everything, let's say, what is happening around the EU market. But again, will this work? It really depends, because this requires that the member states, the authorities that they will be appointed, will work properly. And we already know that this is not the case. Every country goes with its own pace, has its own needs. And there is a very big issue that, again, I'm using GDPR because it's the same model in terms of enforcement that they are trying to do here. They don't have the know-how. So if you go to the Portuguese Data Protection Authority, they don't have even the human resources to be able to assess certain obligations. So imagine how we will work on the AI office, local office level. And so based on that, we will see how it will work or not. For sure, we need something. I think as André mentioned it as well, the majority of the industry knows that we do need some parameters, something to be made mandatory, some safeguards to also promote the trust to the technology, transparency, openness that you wouldn't have in any other way. Whether it will work in practice, it will very much depend on the final text. Already is a positive thing what happened now in this regard. There are a lot of problems still and it will still change, but to make it a bit more dynamic, for sure is a positive thing. And then regarding cars, that was your last question. So it's left out of the liability regime for 2 reasons. First of all, because the discussion around AI liability started by autonomous vehicles, which we don't have. So already with the scale of automation, we do not have vehicles going around, and we are not going to have soon, that arrive at that level of autonomy where they will be driving alone without allowing you to intervene. And why this is important? Because already now you have around the world, and every country has its own road laws, vehicle laws, however they are called, that they regulate you being in the car, driving the car, and having to intervene. So the regime is already sufficient for what we have right now. And I think that's the reason why they took it out, so to sort of change the discussion that was happening for the past 5 to 7 years or so around liability. And because there is not, to this day, there are international laws about this, that there are conventions that we all comply with, but there was not a European initiative around vehicles and road safety. So if they were doing that, it would have to be a regulation, and regulation applies immediately across the EU, and it would have been very intrusive because roads are very linked to the national element. So and traditionally used to be a national matter that each one was regulating on their own. So on the contrary, they focus more on regulating liability of the systems described in the AI Act, and on any other type of AI that we could use, let's say, privately, for which we do not have laws right now. In theory, an autonomous vehicle, even if you own it, even if it's slightly more advanced than what we have right now, it will still fall within the scope of the national laws for road safety. So you're sort of covered, let's say. But I believe they will issue something at some point, to be fair.
Hi. So I belong to a privacy and freedom of speech association, and I'm interested about what the legislation says about adversarial systems. So for example, Google censored this app that will basically send trash data to Google, so Google will know anything about you. And it was censored to the ground, no one knows about it. If adversarial AI systems that fight against it are created, does the legislation protect against that? And the second question is, I do genetic research, and we're on the age of like cheap epigenetic tests right now with the 100,000 genomes project in the UK. So does the legislation say anything about that? Because right now everyone is trying to build a model centered on epigenetics. That's
Can you repeat a bit about the last part? What is
everyone
the
is trying to build a model based on those new data available on human epigenetics that is able to predict like if you're going to have a child when you're a teenager and stuff like that. Okay, thank you.
So for the first, I don't know. That is my reply. It's like, I don't know how is the text and how it would apply. So I won't even guess yet because it's 144 pages. So I don't know what they introduced from the original one. I'll tell you in theory, no. But for the new one, probably because of that broader definition, it will be covered. For the second part is a high risk, as it is right now, the text, because of the sensitivity of the data and health sector is specifically named in one of the sectors that they are considered high risk uses. So it will be a high risk AI system, let's say.
Okay, so I'm really sorry. I know I see some hands. I know you have lots of questions, but we are already lots of minutes passing the schedule hours, so we need to finish. But thank you so much, Iakovina and André. This was such an interesting conversation. And thank you, Unbabel, for receiving us and sponsoring the event. If you have questions, you need resources to start learning, deep learning or AI in general, you have ideas for future talks or whatnot, just reach out to us, Deep Learning Sessions Portugal, and we are here for you. And thank you for being here. And that's it for today. Thank you.